The most famous story about the most powerful woman of the 18th century is a story about a horse, and there is not one word of truth in it. Not one. No letter records it, no ambassador's dispatch reports it. And the courts of Europe kept paid observers in St. Petersburg for the express purpose of reporting things like that. No diary, no memoir, no hostile pamphlet written by anybody alive in Russia in 1796 mentions it at all. The first traces appear afterwards abroad, among a French aristocracy that had just been driven out of its own country by a revolution and had a great deal to say about ambitious women. Catherine II of Russia died of a stroke in her own apartments at 67 years of age with her physicians around her. The lie has outlived the treaties she signed, the cities she founded, and the wars she won. It is worth stating once, plainly, and then setting aside, because it is the oldest instrument there is. When a woman holds power that men have decided she should not hold, nobody argues with her policy. They talk about her body. And the truth is darker than the lie. She was born a minor German princess in a Baltic garrison town with no fortune, no Russian blood, and no legal claim to anything at all. At 14, she was sent east into a country she had never seen. She learned its language at night. She took its religion. She changed her name. And at 33, she took its throne away from her own husband. And 8 days later, he was dead in a country house outside the capital, and she never once permitted anyone to ask how. She wrote to Voltaire for 15 years about liberty. Under her, Russian serfdom came nearer to slavery than it had ever been. 34 years on the throne, the only woman that country has ever called the Great. This is what it cost. She was born on the 2nd of May, 1729, in a brick house in a garrison town on the Baltic, and there was nothing whatever about the room, the family, or the century she arrived in to suggest she would ever matter. The town was Stettin, Prussian then, Polish now, a fortress on the Oder with a customs house and a harbour and a wind off the water for 8 months of the year. Her father commanded the garrison. Christian August, Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, was 38, a professional soldier in the Prussian service, honest, devout, methodical, and permanently short of money. His princely house was one of the several hundred sovereign fragments of the Holy Roman Empire, a title, a coat of arms, a claim to precedence at table, and an income that came almost entirely from an officer's pay. By the standards of Stettin, he was not a poor man. By the standards of the courts against which his daughter would one day be measured, he was destitute. Her mother had been 15 at her wedding and was 16 when the child was born and had wanted a son. Johanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp came from a house immeasurably grander than her husband's. The Holstein-Gottorps were threaded into half the thrones of northern Europe, and she had been handed at 15 to a garrison commander, 22 years her senior, and she never entirely forgave anybody for it. 18 months later, she produced a son and transferred to him the whole of an affection that had never been evenly distributed to begin with. The boy died at 12. The daughter was fed, dressed, corrected, and comprehensively overlooked. The one adult in that house who looked at the child and saw a person was an employee. Her name was Elizabeth Cardell, Babet in the family, a French Huguenot engaged as governess, and she gave the girl 3 things a princedom that size could not otherwise buy: French, the working language of every court in Europe, and the reason a German girl would one day correspond with Voltaire as an equal, Corneille, Racine, Molière, and the fables of La Fontaine, and the habit of reading that came with them, and, apparently for the first time, the experience of being liked. Writing decades afterwards from a throne, the Empress of all the Russias gave that governess more warmth than she gave either parent. Which brings us to the difficulty sitting underneath everything that follows. Almost everything known about the first 14 years of this woman's life comes from a document she wrote herself long afterwards in French, in several successive drafts, as a sovereign who had taken a throne by force and needed posterity to understand how she had come to deserve it. Her memoirs are a genuine primary source and an indispensable one. They are also a case for the defense. The family suppressed them for 2 generations. They were finally printed in London in 1859 by the exile Alexander Herzen, more than 60 years after her death. Where this film uses them, it will say so, and every time a childhood scene arrives with its significance already attached, it is worth remembering that the woman writing it down already knew the ending, which is exactly the trouble with the fortune teller. The story goes that when the girl was about 13, a canon with an amateur enthusiasm for palmistry looked at her and told her mother, in the child's own hearing, that he could see 3 crowns above her head. It is a marvelous scene. It appears in her memoirs and essentially nowhere else. Precisely the sort of episode a life acquires once its ending is known. The rest of that childhood is better documented and much colder. From the age of about 8, she had been on the road, Berlin, Brunswick, Hamburg, Kiel, the little courts of the north, because the German princely states ran a marriage market, and Johanna Elizabeth worked it with the persistence of a woman who had nothing else left to trade. The daughter was the stock she was being shown, and in 1739 the circuit reached Eutin, in Holstein, where a girl of 10 met a boy of 11. His name was Karl Peter Ulrich, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. He was her second cousin, an orphan twice over, raised by a household of soldiers and tutors who beat him and starved him over his lessons and could not manage him at all. He was also, by the sheer arithmetic of dynastic accident, the only surviving grandson of Peter the Great. She noticed, or says she noticed, that the people around him spoke of him with a certain embarrassment, that he was already, at 11, thought too fond of wine. Whether a child of 10 registered that, or whether an empress of 50 arranged the memory afterwards into a shape she needed, nobody can now answer. Then 2 things happened that had nothing to do with her, and between them they made her. The first happened at night in St. Petersburg in November 1741. The unmarried daughter of Peter the Great walked into the barracks of the Preobrazhensky Guards, wearing a cuirass over her gown, and asked the grenadiers whose men they were. They carried her to the Winter Palace on their shoulders. Elizabeth Petrovna took the throne of Russia without a shot fired, arrested the infant emperor, in whose name the country was being governed, and made herself Empress of all the Russias in a single winter night with 1 Guards regiment. Remember that night. In 21 years another woman will do the same thing, in the same city, with the same kind of regiment, and she will have this precedent in front of her while she does it. Elizabeth intended to have no children who could inherit, so she sent to Holstein for the orphan, her own sister's son, brought him to Russia in February 1742, converted him to orthodoxy, renamed him Peter Fyodorovich, and declared him Grand Duke and heir. And one further thread ran back to the shabby house in Stettin. As a girl of 18, Elizabeth had been betrothed to Johanna's own brother, and he had died of smallpox in St. Petersburg weeks before the wedding, and she had never forgotten it. The second thing happened in Anhalt. In 1742, the senior line of the family failed, and Christian August became a reigning prince of the empire. In the same year, Frederick II made him a field marshal. It altered nothing about the money, it altered everything about the paperwork. The daughter of a garrison commander had become the daughter of a sovereign, which happened to be the minimum qualification for what was about to be proposed. On the 1st of January 1744, a courier reached Zerbst with a letter from St. Petersburg. It came from the Marshal of the Grand Duke's household, written on the Empress's instructions, and it said in substance, "Come at once, bring your eldest daughter, bring no one else, tell nobody why, do not bring your husband, travel under another name." Money for the journey was enclosed because the family did not have it. A second letter followed within days from Frederick II of Prussia, who wanted a Prussian-minded girl in the bed of the Russian heir and had identified an inexpensive one. Her father was a Lutheran of the stricter sort, and he understood immediately what the price of that invitation was going to be. He was not invited. What he did instead was write out for his daughter, in his own hand, a set of instructions on how she was to conduct herself and what she was on no account to surrender. They left for Berlin on the 10th of January so that the King of Prussia could inspect the merchandise. He kept her at his own table for an evening, talked to her about opera and poetry and dancing, lent her a court dress out of his sister's wardrobe because her mother had claimed the girl had nothing fit to wear, and afterwards wrote to the Empress of Russia that the child combined the gaiety natural to her age with an intelligence surprising in one so young. On the 16th of January, 4 coaches went east out of Berlin carrying a party travelling under the name of Countess Rheinbeck. At Schwedt, on the Oder, her father got down and said goodbye. They both wept in front of the servants. Neither of them knew it was the last time. And it was. Then the road, in the depth of a North German winter, frozen ruts that threw the carriages about like boats, post-houses with no fire in them, and a girl whose feet went so numb she had to be lifted down and carried inside. At Mitau, the Empress's own conveyance was waiting, a wooden hut on runners, drawn by 10 horses, hung inside with scarlet and gold. And from there they went on over the frozen Dvina to Riga with an escort, and the business began at last to feel like what it was. And somewhere on that road they put the calendar back 11 days, because Russia did not keep time the way the rest of Europe kept it. She was 14 years old, she had been fitted out, coached, borrowed against, and shipped east, and she had understood one thing that her mother, 31 years old, born to this, riding in the same carriage, never grasped at all. She was not being taken to Russia to be married, she was being taken there to be looked at, and the looking had not happened yet. The court was not where they had been told to find it. They reached St. Petersburg in the first week of February 1744 and found it half shut. The Empress had moved the government south to Moscow for the winter. So the party was turned round and sent after her, day and night, in relays of sledges. On the evening of the 9th of February, a girl of 14 was lifted down into a Moscow courtyard, put into a fresh gown at somebody else's speed, and walked into a room to be looked at. The Annenhof was a great timber palace of corridors and candlelight, and at the end of them stood Elizabeth Petrovna, Empress of all the Russias, 34 years old, in full court dress. The description everybody still uses, the silver-embroidered hoop, the black feather, the diamond, the sheer physical fact of her, is the girl's own, written decades later by a woman who needed that evening to matter. The interview was short, and nothing in it was intellectual. She was being measured for health, for manner, for temper, for the likelihood of children, and for one thing she could do nothing about, which was her mother's face, because Johanna Elizabeth's brother was the man Elizabeth had been going to marry in 1727, before smallpox took him weeks short of the wedding. She is said to have wept at the resemblance. She passed. The next day was the Grand Duke's 16th birthday, and the visitors were told they were staying. Nothing had been settled. No contract, no date, no announcement. Sophie Augusta Friederike of Anhalt-Zerbst had been approved for consideration, which is a different thing, and she grasped it at once. Within days she went to work. 3 men were appointed to her: Seaman Todorsky, a churchman who spoke German, Vasily Adodurov to teach her Russian, and a dancing master named Lange. It was Adodurov who mattered. The story everyone tells is that she got out of bed at night and walked the freezing floor barefoot, repeating vocabulary aloud so as not to sleep over it. It comes from her memoirs and essentially nowhere else, her own account of her own diligence. The result is not in doubt. Within a few years, she spoke Russian and wrote it, badly at first, and always in a German accent she never lost, in a country where that accent had lately been a liability. The decade before Elizabeth's coup had been thick with German ministers and favourites, and the grenadiers who carried Elizabeth to the Winter Palace believed they were throwing the Germans out. Elizabeth had then imported a German heir, and was now inspecting a German bride. The bride had noticed. What she did about it was the first political act of her life. She became Russian in public, at speed, in front of witnesses, while the boy she had been brought there to marry sulked for Holstein in the next room. She had already worked out which of the two was the prize. It was not the husband, it was the country. Then in March she nearly died. It was probably pleurisy, some accounts say pneumonia, and it held her in bed for weeks. Her mother, who had watched her own brother bled to death by physicians, refused to let them bleed her. Elizabeth came back from a pilgrimage and overruled her, and they took blood from her 16 times. The number is hers from the memoirs. What happened next was round Moscow inside a day. Johanna, at the worst of it, proposed sending for a Lutheran pastor. The girl in the bed said she would rather have Simon Todorsky. Faith, or calculation, or a frightened 15-year-old reaching for the one adult in the building who had been kind to her. This film offers all 3 and settles on none. The effect was identical either way. By the time she was upright, the court had decided she was one of theirs, and her father's letters from Zerbst objecting to the conversion had begun to read, in Moscow, like letters from abroad. While the daughter was becoming indispensable, the mother was destroying herself. Johanna Elizabeth had come east as Frederick II's asset and behaved like one, carrying messages, attaching herself to the French envoy, the Marquis de la Chetardie, in a campaign against the Chancellor, Alexei Bestuchev-Ryumin. Bestuchev read other people's post for a living. His office intercepted Chetardie's dispatches and decoded them. They carried his private assessment of the Empress of Russia, idle, frivolous, governed by whoever had spoken to her last. Elizabeth read every line in translation. In June 1744, Chetardie was ordered out of the country, and Johanna, named in the papers, was finished from that hour. She was not expelled at once. That would have advertised the business. She was tolerated until the wedding, ignored, and then sent home. She never came back. She died in Paris in 1760 in debt and under another name, and the debts were paid afterwards by the daughter she had last seen in 1745. The daughter learned the lesson and never unlearned it. At that court, the people who talked were removed. The people who listened stayed. On the morning of the 28th of June, 1744, in a church in the Kremlin, in a gown of red and silver and no jewels, she recited the Orthodox Confession of Faith in Russian from memory before the whole court. A long text, in a language she had been studying 4 months, delivered without stumbling. Several of those present are said to have wept. She was received into the Russian church and given a new name. Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. She was 15 years old. They took all of it. Not only the Christian name her father had chosen, but the patronymic, the part of a Russian name that tells a room whose child you are. And what replaced it had nothing to do with Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst. That name had been made once before for another foreign woman who converted in order to marry into this family. She had ended as Catherine I, and she was Elizabeth's mother. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. The date was the 28th of June, 1744. The next day she was betrothed to the Grand Duke Peter Fyodorovich and became a Grand Duchess of Russia, with an imperial highness in front of her name, an income of her own, and a household to run it. What she had acquired was not a marriage, it was a post, and she had begun to see the shape of the man attached to it. He was 16, he had been in Russia 2 years, and nobody had thought to ask whether he wanted to be. He drilled the servants. He was noisily homesick for a duchy he had left as a child, and contemptuous of the country he would inherit and the church he had been made to join. He talked to her constantly, by her account, about everything on earth except herself. Then, that winter, on the road between Moscow and St. Petersburg, he stopped at a post house with a fever, and it was smallpox. Elizabeth turned her carriages round and went to nurse him herself, which was a reckless thing to do with the succession, and after some weeks he lived. When Catherine was brought in to see him again, in a badly lit room in February 1745, she did not at first recognize him, the face swollen and pitted and marked for life, the shaved head under an enormous wig. By her own account, she was appalled. She hid it. She was becoming very good at that. She had been in the country 5 months. She had given up her language, her church, and the name her father had chosen for her, and she had done it with a composure that unsettled the people who were watching. What she had not yet given up was anything she actually wanted, because nothing she wanted had yet been asked for. That came 14 months later, in a cathedral on the Nevsky Prospect, at the end of a wedding day that had begun before dawn and ran 10 hours. The procession, the crowns held over their heads, the banquet, the ball, and then a room, and a bed, and a door. She was 16. He was 17. The court withdrew and left them in it. And for the next 9 years, according to everything she ever wrote about it afterwards, nothing happened in that room at all. The wedding of the 21st of August, 1745, was not a family occasion. It was a state announcement, and it was priced like one. Elizabeth had sent abroad for accounts of how the great courts of Europe staged such things and then told her people to exceed them. Every ambassador in St. Petersburg wrote home about it, which was the point. What the display announced was not a marriage, but a succession. Peter the Great's line had come down to one sickly nephew out of Holstein. Now the nephew had a wife, and the largest country in Europe would stop being one accident away from civil war. She was 16, he was 17, and then, for 9 years, nothing happened at all. 9 years is her figure from her own memoirs, and the non-consummation is the standard reading of the evidence. It is worth saying out loud that most of the evidence is hers. The consequence was recorded by other people, in dispatches, in household accounts, in the shortening temper of an empress. There was no child, there was no sign of one, and the entire value of the Grand Duchess Catherine Alexeyevna to the Russian state was a birth that was not occurring, which is the first appearance of the thing that would follow her to the grave and 2 centuries past it. For 9 years, the most urgent political question in Russia concerning a woman who would one day legislate for some 20 million people was whether her body would produce an infant. Nothing, she thought, interested anybody in the building. 4 decades later, with an empire under her hand, the argument would still be about her body. It started here. The husband on the other side of it was not a villain. He was a catastrophe, and he had been manufactured. Peter at 17, at 20, at 25, had no occupation, no authority, and no way out. The aunt who had imported him to secure her line could not bear him, and kept him from any share of government, no department, no seat in council, no duty beyond remaining alive and remaining the heir. He was given toys instead of work. A detachment of his own Holstein troops was quartered near Oranienbaum, and he drilled them in the garden for hours in all weathers. He played the violin badly, loudly, and late. He kept model soldiers on the bed. And in her memoirs there is the rat. She wrote that she came into his room and found a rat hanging from a small gallows, and that when she asked, he explained the animal had been tried by court-martial and executed under the Articles of War for getting on to the ramparts of his model fortress and eating a sentry made of starch. It is one of the most quoted anecdotes in the literature. It comes from her and nowhere else, which is precisely the problem. It is the best single piece of evidence anybody has for what her husband was, and the witness is the woman who took his throne and then spent her life explaining why she had been entitled to. Underneath the rat there is a colder account, better documented, flattering nobody. The boy had been beaten and starved over his lessons by the men who raised him, taken out of one country at 14 and set down in another whose language he did not speak and whose church he was made to join, which is, to the year, exactly what was done to her. She had a governess who liked her. He was handled with patience by nobody, ever. The difference in what the two of them became is not entirely a difference of character. They were also, both of them, watched. Elizabeth appointed their households herself, and the appointments were surveillance. Letters in and out of the young court were read. In 1746 she installed Maria Choglakova beside the Grand Duchess, with an explicit commission: prevent anything improper, produce a pregnancy. Her husband Nikolai did the same office for Peter. Servants she liked were reassigned, and friends removed one at a time. The chamberlain Andrei Chernyshev, of whom she had grown fond, was arrested and sent away, and the questioning that followed was about her. She had no privacy, no money of her own, and letters to her mother routed through the Collegium of Foreign Affairs and drafted for her. And she had, quite literally, nothing to do. That went on for 8 years. Which brings us to Sergei Saltykov, a chamberlain at the young court in his middle 20s, married, and by every description a very handsome man. The relationship dates to about 1752, and the interesting thing is not that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen. Choglakova, whose whole commission was the prevention of precisely this, is understood by most historians to have smoothed the way. 8 years had produced nothing. The Empress was aging. The dynasty rested on one unwell and unpopular young man. The requirement, an infant in a cradle, soon, would be met by whatever means came to hand, and not inquired into. Saltykov was sent abroad as an envoy within months of the birth, and the court that had arranged the means spent the next 40 years using them against her. Paul Petrovich was born on the 20th of September 1754, after a labour that ran through a night and most of a day. The Empress took the child out of the room, not in the following days, within the hour. He was carried to her own apartments, put into her own care, and there he stayed. He was baptized under her direction, brought up under her eye, and shown to his mother at intervals measured in weeks and then in months. His mother, by her own account, and it is her account alone, was left where she had been delivered, on a mattress between two windows while the palace went out after the baby, she was rewarded. 100,000 rubles was sent to her, an enormous public sum, the kind that announces a service rendered. Then the Empress's treasury, which was short, sent to ask for it back, because an equivalent sum had to go to Peter, and there was not enough for both. The whole transaction took days. There remains the question everyone asks, and it is not going to be answered here. Her memoirs insinuate, without squarely stating it, that the child's father was Saltykov and not her husband, and she had reasons to want that believed, since from 1762 Paul was the rival claimant to the throne she was sitting on, and the two of them detested each other for the rest of her life. Against it, he grew up resembling Peter in the face and a good deal more unsettlingly in temperament. A modern examination of the Y chromosome down the Romanov male line is generally taken to cut against Saltykov. It is not settled. It will not be settled here, which leaves the room she was actually in. She lay on that mattress between the two windows for hours, wet through, in a draught, with the door open, and nobody left in the room to close it, because every human being in the palace had followed the child. It was 17 days before she was permitted to look at her son, and when she was, it was at a distance, for a few minutes, with the Empress present. She understood exactly what she was then, not a wife, not a mother, a brood animal that had discharged its function and could now be put back out to grass. And somewhere inside those 17 days, she stopped waiting for the court to give her a place in it. If there was 1 hour in which the Empress Catherine II was actually made, it was probably one of those, because what she did next was not weep, or intrigue, or write home. She began to read, and she read in that hostile and idle palace for the next 8 years everything the 18th century had produced about how power ought to work, while the woman who had taken her son grew slowly, visibly, unmistakably old. For the 8 years between the birth of her son and the summer that changed everything, Catherine Alexeyevna had no office, no money of her own, no letter that reached her unopened, and nothing to do. So she read. It is the flattest sentence in her life, and it is the one the rest of it stands on. She began badly, on her own account, with novels. Then a volume of Voltaire spoiled her for anything slighter. After Voltaire, the Annals of Tacitus. After Tacitus, 4 volumes of Pierre Bayle, which she gave 2 years to in a palace where the alternative was cards. Then Montesquieu's De l'Esprit des Lois. The list is from her own memoirs and carries their standing warning, a genuine primary source, and a brief for the defense. Tacitus is the one that mattered, a Roman senator describing how imperial power behaves when nobody can compel it to explain itself. The accidents that are not accidents, the silence around a death. By her own account, it changed the way she saw everything in front of her. She stopped reading events as accidents and began reading them as motives. Montesquieu gave her a vocabulary, laws as objects with causes, institutions that must fit the country they sit in, and a distinction between monarchy and despotism she would spend 30 years failing to hold. And here, very quietly, is the problem that would follow her to the end. Those books were written for countries with machinery, parliaments, estates, charters, courts that could not be closed by a signature. She was reading them in an empire where the autocrat's word was itself the law, and 9 people in 10 were the legal property of the 10th. What she was assembling was a theory of government. What she would inherit was a country the theory did not describe. A theory, however, is not a faction. In June 1755, Sir Charles Hanbury Williams arrived as British ambassador with instructions to buy Russia. Within 7 months, his own government had allied with Prussia, and his mission was dead. So he did what ambassadors do when the present reign is closed to them. He went to work on the next one. In his suite was a Polish nobleman of 23 with great charm, excellent connections and no fortune. Stanisław Poniatowski. Remember him? The relationship ran 3 years, and the court has been retelling it as a romance ever since. The consequential fact is that it was her apprenticeship. Through those 2 men she entered a working foreign policy faction with foreign backers, a cipher, and an interest in the succession. Hanbury Williams lent her money, secured on nothing but the expectation that she would one day be able to be grateful, and she wrote to him. That correspondence survives, and it is the most incriminating thing she ever wrote. At 27, she was setting out in ink what she meant to do when Elizabeth died. In the Russia of Alexander Shuvalov's secret chancellery, that was the offence the institution existed to detect. On the 9th of December 1757, she bore a daughter, Anna Petrovna, whom the Empress removed as she had removed Paul, and who was dead before her 2nd birthday. Then the structure came down at once. Chancellor Bestuchev fell. The army had beaten the Prussians at Gross-Jägersdorf in August 1757, and then marched back out of East Prussia. The Empress had collapsed in a church weeks earlier, and the reading in every embassy was that the army was being preserved for the heir, a declared admirer of the King of Prussia. Catherine had written to the commander. The letters were produced. Bestuchev was arrested in February 1758 and stripped of everything, and had time before they came to burn his papers, among them a draft scheme giving the Grand Duchess a formal share of government on her husband's accession. That fire is very probably the only reason she was not finished at 28. She was left for weeks not knowing how much was known. Then, in the small hours of a night that spring, she was brought before the Empress. Peter was in the room. So was Shuvalov, who ran the political police. She did not principally defend herself. She wept and knelt and asked to be sent home to her family in Germany. It was not a surrender. It was the one request the Empress could not grant. Sending her home announced to every court in Europe that the Russian succession had failed, that the heir was unfit, that the throne of a country at war rested on a boy of 3. Elizabeth refused. Catherine stayed, was not punished, and within a year was back in favour. She had learned the thing that would put her on the throne 4 years later, and it is not about courage. You did not win at that court by being stronger. You won by working out what your opponent could not afford to do, and then asking for it. 3 men have now been named as figures in her private life. Each was also an instrument, a chamberlain the state used to produce an heir, a secretary who came with a foreign faction, and an artillery officer who came with the guards. The private life has been counted for 2.5 centuries. The politics has not. Grigory Orlov was 26, an artillery officer of no particular birth, physically enormous, who had been at Zorndorf in August 1758, one of the worst days of the whole 7 Years' War, where he was wounded 3 times and did not leave the line. In the barracks that was worth more than a title. What she acquired in about 1760 was not a companion. Orlov had 4 brothers, Alexei, Fyodor, Ivan, Vladimir, and between them the 5 held the only currency that has ever decided a Russian succession, personal credit with several thousand armed men in the guards regiments who drank and gambled with them and would follow them. Alexei, above all, remember that name. By the summer of 1761 she was pregnant by Orlov, and there was no version of that fact she survived if her husband learned of it. She concealed it through the autumn and the winter in a palace with no privacy. The boy was born on the 11th of April, 1762, and was out of the building within the hour, wrapped in a beaver skin and carried off by her valet, Vasily Shkurin, who is supposed to have set fire to his own house that day to draw the emperor away. A court story of long standing, never anchored to a document. He was raised by the valet's family, given later the name Bobrinsky, and acknowledged in the end not by her, but by her son. And there was one further thing wrong with her position, and it is usually left out. Nikita Panin was Paul's governor, a career diplomat, cautious, formidably able, and already half a conspirator. But what Panin wanted was not what she wanted. His plan was a regency, remove the husband, proclaim the boy emperor at 7, and let the mother govern in his name with a council beside her until he came of age. That is not a throne. That is a lease with a break clause running out in 8 years. She never argued with him about it. She let him work. The Empress Elizabeth died on Christmas Day, 1761, after months of strokes and terrors, in a palace where the priests had been coming and going for weeks. At the moment the announcement was made and the court went to swear its oath to a new emperor, the woman who had spent 18 years preparing for exactly this day was carrying a child that could never be acknowledged without a legal claim of any kind, and standing in a black gown beside a husband who had just become the most powerful man in Europe's largest country. She had allies in 3 regiments. She had a plan, or the beginnings of one. What she did not have was a reason, because in Russia, in that century, nobody overthrew an emperor for being unpleasant. Her husband was about to supply the reason himself. Over the next 6 months, Peter III would do something almost nobody in Russian history has managed before or since. He would make himself hated by the army, the church, the nobility, the Senate, and the street, every single one of them, in the same half year, entirely by his own efforts. He was emperor for 6 months and 3 days. In that time, Peter III managed something with almost no parallel in the history of the country. He had been imported to rule. He turned every organized interest in Russia against him at once, and he did it without cruelty, without a single political execution, and very largely by accident, which makes the caricature of him unfair, and it is worth saying so before the demolition begins, because 2 of the more consequential acts of the Russian 18th century belong to those 6 months, and both are his. On the 18th of February 1762, he signed the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility, releasing the Russian nobility from the compulsory state service Peter the Great had bound them to for life. In the same month, he abolished the secret chancellery, the political police that had run on denunciation since Peter the Great. Neither was hers. She would spend 23 years completing the first and be given the credit for it. He was not a monster. He was a catastrophic politician. The demolition went as follows. The Russian army had fought Frederick II of Prussia for 5 years, had occupied East Prussia and administered it as a Russian province, and had buried a great many of its own doing it. In May 1762, Peter handed all of it back by treaty because he admired Frederick more than he had ever admired anything in Russia. Then he proposed to turn that same army against Denmark to recover a duchy on the Danish frontier for the German house he had been born into. Not one man in the ranks cared about Schleswig, and all of them were told they were marching there. He put the guards into Prussian-cut uniforms and Prussian drill, and made it plain that he thought them a decorative garrison indulged too long. He announced the secularization of the church's lands, which meant the state taking the monastery estates and the several 100,000 peasants attached to them, and he had been converted to orthodoxy at 14 against his own preference, and had never stopped saying in company what he thought of it. He had lived in the country for 2 decades and had never learned it. Then, in June, at a state dinner for the Prussian peace, in front of the whole diplomatic corps of Europe, he lost his temper with his wife down the table and called her a fool. By the accounts that reached the foreign missions, she wept where she sat. He is said to have ordered her arrest that night and to have been talked out of it by his uncle. He was also making no secret of an intention to put her aside and marry Elizabeth Vorontsova. In Russia, in that century, a set-aside wife meant a convent, and everyone at that table understood it. That dinner is where the conspiracy stopped being a possibility and became a schedule. It was not large, perhaps 40 officers, with no fallback and no margin at all. Its centre was Grigory Orlov and his 4 brothers, who between them had years of drinking and fighting credit in every guards barracks in the capital. Its most energetic recruiter was Princess Yekaterina Dashkova, 19 years old, and a detail that says a good deal about the family arithmetic of that court, Elizabeth Vorontsova's younger sister. Dashkova's memoirs place her nearer the centre of that week than any other source does, and they are used here the way this film uses Catherine's own, gratefully and with the flag flying. And Nikita Panin was in it, and not for her. What Panin wanted was a regency. The 7-year-old Paul proclaimed emperor, his mother a caretaker, until the boy came of age. Nothing between them was ever settled, and she let it stay unsettled, because the question would be answered by whoever was standing in front of the regiments on the day. On the 27th of June, Captain Pyotr Pasek of the Preobrazhensky Guards was arrested. That was all it took. An arrest meant interrogation. Interrogation meant names, and there were only 40 names. The coup happened on the 28th because it could not wait until the 29th. She was at Peterhof, in the small waterside pavilion called Montplaisir. Peter was at Oranienbaum a few miles along the coast, expected at Peterhof the next day for his name day. Early on the morning of the 28th of June, 1762, the 9th of July by the calendar the rest of Europe was keeping, Alexei Orlov came into her room and woke her with a few words to the effect that everything was ready and she was to be proclaimed. She dressed, got into the carriage he had waiting, and the horses were spent by the time they reached the capital. She went first to the Izmailovsky barracks, where the men came out into the yard half-dressed and swore to her in the open, with a priest fetched to hold up the cross, and their colonel, Kirill Razumovsky, hetman of Ukraine, standing where they could all see him. The Semyonovsky did not wait to be asked and met the column in the street. Then the Preobrazhensky, where the officers hesitated briefly, and then did not. The Preobrazhensky were the regiment that had carried Elizabeth Petrovna to the Winter Palace on their shoulders in November 1741, and 21 years later, in the same city and the same grey early hours, they did it again, for a woman who had been 12 years old and 1,000 miles away when they did it the first time. At the Kazan Cathedral, the Archbishop of Novgorod, Dmitry Sechenov, proclaimed her sovereign in her own right, empress and autocrat of all the Russias, with the 7-year-old Paul named as her heir, and nothing said about a regency. Panin lost that argument standing in a church without a word addressed to him. By the middle of the morning the Senate and the Holy Synod had come to her in the Winter Palace and sworn. 18 years earlier to the day, on the 28th of June 1744, a girl of 15 had stood in a church in Moscow in a gown of red and silver and been chrismated into the Russian church under the name Catherine. It had taken a morning. Not a shot had been fired in the capital. In the afternoon she came out to the regiments in a Preobrazhensky officer's coat and here the best-known story of the day is set. A sergeant of the Horse Guards, 22 years old, is said to have noticed that her borrowed sword carried no knot at the hilt, and to have ridden out of the line to give her his own. His name was Grigory Potemkin. It cannot be checked anywhere it might be checked. It is the story as it has always been told, and exactly the kind of story that grows backwards onto a man once he becomes important. What is solid is that he was there, and that he was rewarded afterwards. Everybody was rewarded. Money, rank, land, and the human beings who came with land went out to the 3 regiments on a scale the Treasury felt for years, because a throne taken with an army is paid for the same morning. The Orlov brothers were made counts, which left the husband. By 9 o'clock that evening she was riding west out of the capital at the head of some 14,000 men in a green Preobrazhensky officer's coat borrowed from a lieutenant on a grey horse, with her hair down under a soldier's hat and a sprig of oak in it, and the column singing behind her on the Peterhof road. 18 miles away her husband spent the day writing orders and cancelling them. He thought of Kronstadt and arrived to find the fortress had already sworn to her. He thought of the army in Pomerania and did nothing about it. On the 29th of June he signed what they put in front of him, and it took 1 sheet of paper to stop being emperor of all the Russias, and by every account of the people in the room he seemed mostly relieved. He asked for 2 things: to be allowed to go home to Holstein and to keep his mistress. He was given neither. They put him in a closed carriage with the blinds down and drove him 17 miles inland to a country house called Ropsha, and posted a guard on the doors and put Alexei Orlov in command of it. He had 7 days left to live, and every serious historian who has ever looked at what happened in that house has come out of the archive disagreeing with the last one. Ropsha was not a prison, and nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why not. It stood 17 miles inland from the Gulf of Finland, a country house of the kind the imperial family kept by the dozen. No walls, no casemates, no garrison. Into it, on the 29th of June, 1762, they put the most dangerous single object in the Russian Empire. Peter Fyodorovich had been a disastrous emperor for 6 months, but he was the grandson of Peter the Great and Elizabeth's anointed heir. A man with a claim by blood in a country whose new sovereign had none. Russia had fortresses built for precisely this, and had used them within living memory. He was sent to a country house with a handful of officers on the doors. What is known of the 7 days that followed is thin, and nearly all of it comes from men with an overwhelming interest in how it sounded. He was ill, or said he was. A physician was sent. He asked for his violin, his dog, his German servant. Some of it came. He asked in writing to go home to Holstein, and was refused. The guard was commanded by Alexei Orlov, the brother who had ridden to Montplaisir before dawn on the 28th to wake her. With him was Prince Fyodor Baryatinsky, and among the officers Pyotr Pasek, whose arrest on the 27th had forced the conspiracy to move a day early. The men who had taken the throne now stood on the doors of the man they had taken it from. There was, by every account, a great deal of drinking in that house. Alexei Orlov was the formidable brother, huge, scarred, fearless. He held the door at Ropsha, remember that. On the 6th of July, 1762, and the 17th, by the calendar, the rest of Europe kept. Peter III died in that house. He was 34, 8 days after the coup, 7 after he signed the throne away. That is the end of what is not in dispute. 3 letters attributed to Alexei Orlov at Ropsha are known. The first 2 are unremarkable. The third is the document on which the entire case has rested for 2.5 centuries. In it, the writer reports a quarrel at table, that it had gone too far before anyone could get between them, that the man was dead, that he does not himself understand how they came to do it, and he begs her forgiveness. That is a description of the letter. It is not a quotation of it, and the distinction is the whole of this chapter, because the letter does not exist, not the original. Nothing was found in her papers, and nothing has surfaced since. What 2 centuries of biographers have worked from is a copy coming down through Count Fyodor Rostopchin's circle, close to her son, and surfacing in the 1790s, 30 years after the night it describes. Historians have questioned its authenticity ever since. The language, the chain of custody, the convenience of a confession to regicide appearing in exactly the hands that had a use for it, none of which makes it a forgery. Copies of lost originals are ordinary currency in the 18th century archive, and this one has been defended as often as attacked. The honest statement is narrow. The most important document in the case survives at one remove, and no historian living has seen the original. It can be described, it cannot close anything, and she never explained. Her memoirs are the most sustained self-accounting any European sovereign has left, break off in every surviving redaction, years before 1762. She stopped writing before she reached the part that needed accounting for. On the 7th of July, a manifesto went out over her name. The former emperor had been carried off by a violent hemorrhoidal colic. The autopsy language was vague and gestured at apoplexy. The body was laid out briefly at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery in a Holstein uniform. The face was reported dark. The 18th century read that as poison. Modern medicine reads discoloration several other ways, none of which settles anything. Then he was buried there, and not across the river, in the Peter and Paul Cathedral where the Tsars went, because he had never been crowned. A small administrative point, and it stood for 34 years. Then his son corrected it, and made the men who had stood on the doors at Ropsha walk in that procession, carrying the imperial regalia. The courts of Europe settled privately on murder within weeks, and said so in dispatches that survive. And in the same breath, no contemporary evidence establishes her foreknowledge. 4 things could have happened. The honest course is to set them out and leave all 4 standing. 1. She ordered it. No document for that has ever been produced, and the men who would have received it were within a year among the richest in Russia. 2. She let it be understood that it would be convenient without ever saying the sentence. Not an order, an atmosphere. A woman 8 days into a reign taken by force, a deposed emperor alive 17 miles down the road, men around her who had staked their necks and could count. Nothing has to be written down for that, which is why it can never be disproved. 3. It happened without her, and she chose afterwards not to look. This fits her later conduct best and proves the least, because the conduct is identical either way. Nobody was tried, and nobody was questioned in any proceeding that survives. Alexei Orlov was not disgraced or exiled. He was rewarded and went on being rewarded for 40 years. What she did in public was nothing, and a nothing is not evidence, because it is what a guilty sovereign and a frightened one would both have done. 4. It was more or less what they said. He was 34, in poor health, drinking hard in a strange house under guard. Men in that condition died in that century without assistance, and an 18th century autopsy could not have excluded it. The least fashionable of the 4, and not impossible. Most historians who go into the archive come out between the 2nd and the 3rd. Hardly any comes out holding a document. And the difference is not a technicality, it is the difference between a sovereign who permitted a killing and one who inherited it, the entire moral weight of a 34-year reign, turning on a conversation that either did or did not happen and was never written down. That is where it stops. Not because the question is small, but because it is unanswerable. And tidying it up is the one thing this story has already had too much of. For 7 days in July 1762, there was a door in a country house 17 miles from the sea, with Alexei Orlov's men outside it. Everything that can be proved happened on that side. Everything that matters happened on the other. And the door was never opened for anybody who wrote it down. The manifesto blamed a hemorrhoidal colic. Nobody in Europe believed it, and nobody inside Russia was permitted to ask. And both of those things stayed true for the next 34 years. She was crowned in Moscow on the 22nd of September, under a crown that had been built in 2 months and had not yet been paid for, in front of a church that had sworn to her, a senate that had sworn to her, and 3 regiments who knew perfectly well that they were the reason she was standing there. And 2 years later, on an island in the Neva, the other emperor, the one who had been arrested in his cradle at 15 months old and had spent every one of his 23 years in a cell, who could barely speak and had never in his life seen a street, was cut down by his own jailers while a young officer tried to set him free. The standing order was that he was not to be taken alive. She had read that order and confirmed it and signed her name. 2 dead emperors in 24 months, which left a German woman on the Russian throne with no blood claim, no crowned husband, no legitimacy but the guards, and exactly one way to survive it. She was going to have to be, in front of the whole watching continent, the most enlightened monarch alive. The law of the country she had just taken was a book printed in 1649. It was called the Sobornoye Ulozhenie, the Assembly Code, promulgated under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich 113 years before she was crowned, in a Russia with no navy, no Baltic coastline, and no city on the Neva. It ran to close on 1,000 articles, and it was still, in every court in the empire, the law. It prescribed death for speaking against the sovereign and the knout for a great deal else. And in its 11th chapter, it had done the one thing that outweighed all the rest. It abolished the term of years within which a landowner could reclaim a runaway peasant, and so made that peasant and his children and his children's children the permanent property of the estate they were born on. Russian serfdom did not begin with a philosophy. It began as an administrative amendment. Every sovereign since Peter the Great had tried to replace that book. Peter appointed a commission for it. So did Catherine I, and Anna and Elizabeth. They sat, they drafted, they were dissolved, and the Code of 1649 stayed where it was. Catherine decided to write the replacement herself. She worked at it for more than 2 years in French, in her own hand, in the early mornings when she did all her serious work. What came out of it was the nakaz, the instruction, 526 articles, published in 1767 and translated within months into German, Latin, English, and French. It was not original, and she never pretended otherwise. The substance came out of Montesquieu's De l'Esprit des Lois and out of Cesare Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, a book 3 years old when she took it up. She told correspondents cheerfully that she had robbed Montesquieu for the benefit of her empire, and appeared to regard the theft as a public service. What matters is not that she stole, it is what she chose to steal. She took the argument that punishment exists to prevent a crime rather than to avenge it. She took the proposition that the laws are there to secure the safety of every individual subject, and that where a citizen's fate is being decided, the prejudices of rank and fortune ought to be made to fall silent. And she took Beccaria on torture and set it down in a state document under her own name. In the English of the London translation printed the following year, the article ran that the use of torture is contrary to all the dictates of nature and reason, and that mankind itself cries out against it and demands loudly the total abolition of it. That is the Empress of all the Russias in print in 1767. The drafts had contained more than that. Among the material she wrote and did not publish were articles on the condition of the peasantry, on what an owner might and might not do, on making it possible for a serf to buy his way out. Before publication, she read the manuscript to the men whose cooperation she needed: senators, generals, officials, the working aristocracy of her own regime. They were, to a man, owners of serfs. By her own later account, she struck a great deal of it out. What went first was the peasants. This is the shape of the entire reign, and it is worth being exact. She was an autocrat. There was no constitution above her, no parliament, no court that could overrule a word she said. And she could not do this, not would not, could not, and knew it. 200 families had put her on the throne with 3 regiments 5 years earlier, and the same families could take her off it, and the property those families held was people. And in 1765, while the instruction was still in draft, she signed a decree permitting a landlord to sentence his serfs to hard labor in Siberia. Paper is patient. It takes whatever is written on it. In September 1764, while those drafts were going back and forth, she had also put a former lover, Stanisław Poniatowski, on the throne of Poland, elected king with Russian troops nearby and Russian money already spread among the electors. On the 30th of July 1767, in Moscow, she opened the assembly that was to turn the instruction into a working code. 564 deputies, the figure moves a little between accounts, elected from the nobility, the towns, the state peasants, the Cossack hosts, the government offices, and the non-Russian peoples of the empire, Tatars, Bashkirs, Samoyeds, seated in the same chamber as senators. They arrived carrying something close to 1,500 written instructions from the communities that elected them. The serfs of private landowners, something near half the population of Russia, were not represented at all. Then the assembly began, and the first thing it did was debate what title to confer on the Empress. It offered her a style containing the word great. She kept mother of the fatherland and returned the rest. Then the instruction was read aloud to them. Then, over more than 200 sittings under their marshal, Alexander Bibikov, the deputies discovered they did not agree about anything whatever. The nobles wanted the merchants kept out of the ownership of serfs. The merchants wanted serfs of their own. The Cossacks wanted their liberties confirmed in writing. The townsmen wanted the nobility out of trade. And the few who raised the peasant question, one a nobleman from Kozlov named Grigory Korobyin, who argued that a serf ought at least to own securely what he had bought with his own labour, was shouted down by the room. The commission was not sabotaged. Nobody strangled it. It demonstrated in public and at length that the country had no consensus to codify. The same years produced the other half of her, a foundling home in Moscow in 1763, and in 1764 the Smolny Institute, both on Ivan Betskoy's plan, Smolny the first state-funded boarding school for girls in Russia, taking them at 5 or 6 and keeping them until 18. The foundling home buried most of the infants brought to it, as foundling hospitals did in every capital in that century. The Smolny girls came out speaking French and reading philosophy, which no Russian woman of any rank had been offered before. The commission moved to St. Petersburg in February 1768. That autumn, the Ottoman Empire declared war, and in December she prorogued it, a good many of the deputies being officers wanted with the army. The instruction itself had gone out across Europe, and in France, copies shipped from St. Petersburg were stopped at the frontier by order of Louis XV. It never governed anybody. It made her famous. The deputies went home. The subcommittees ground on for another 5 years and produced nothing at all. There was no code. There was never going to be a code. Russia would not have one until 1832, 36 years after she was dead. What there was instead was a filing cabinet, 1,500 written complaints from every estate in the empire, the most complete survey of Russian grievance ever assembled, sitting in an archive where nobody was allowed to read it. And there was a lesson, and she had learned it exactly, and she would govern by it for the next 28 years. The nobility would not give up the serfs, not one soul, not 1 acre, not for the Empress, not for Montesquieu, not for anybody. And in the same year that her instruction went out to Europe declaring that torture was contrary to nature and reason and was banned in France for being too dangerous to print, in that same year, in Russia, she signed a decree forbidding a serf to complain about his master, which meant that the day the serfs decided to stop complaining and take their freedom themselves, she would have to pick a side. That day was 6 years away. It came out of the east, out of the Cossack country on the Yaik River, and it came wearing her dead husband's name. Ferney was a village in French territory a few miles outside Geneva, and the man who lived there had chosen it for the border. Voltaire settled there in 1759, the most celebrated writer in Europe, and what recommended the place was that Switzerland began at the end of the road. He never went to Russia and never saw the Neva or the Winter Palace or the woman whose reputation he spent the last 15 years of his life manufacturing. They wrote to each other from 1763, the year after she took the throne, until his death on the 30th of May, 1778. Well over 100 letters across 1,500 miles between two people who never once stood in the same room. Each was useful to the other, and neither was confused about it. He needed proof that his ideas could be installed somewhere real. She needed Europe to stop discussing how she had come by her throne. He gave her the title that stuck, the Semiramis of the North, a queen out of Assyrian legend who built, conquered, and, in the tragedy Voltaire had staged in 1748, murdered her husband. Whether he intended the echo is not recoverable. The phrase travelled anyway. It did the work of an army. The letters are not what people assume. Philosophy, flattery both ways, gossip, architecture, her health and his. She reported the progress of a war against the Ottoman Empire in roughly the tone of a woman describing a satisfactory renovation. They do not contain the serfs, not as a problem, not as a project, barely as a subject. 15 years of the most widely read correspondence in Europe between a monarch and a philosopher, on liberty, on toleration, on the improvement of mankind, passes over the condition of nearly half the monarch's subjects almost in silence. He did not press, she did not raise it. Both of them knew exactly which subjects the friendship could survive. Which brings us to the other thing she was doing with the Enlightenment, which was buying it. In 1765, Denis Diderot, editor of the Encyclopédie, put his library up for sale to raise his daughter's dowry. Catherine bought it, left the books where they stood, in his house in Paris, made him librarian of his own collection at a salary, and paid the salary 50 years in advance. The most graceful act of patronage of the century, and precisely a purchase. She did the same to Voltaire, though she had to wait for him to die. In 1779, she bought his library from his heirs, 7,000 volumes, and shipped it to St. Petersburg, where it still is. The pictures had come the same way. A Berlin merchant's collection bought in 1764 to found what became the Hermitage. She was buying the Enlightenment and having it delivered. And then, in 1768, she did something no other sovereign in Europe had the nerve to do. She had watched smallpox work. The husband she deposed had caught it at 16 and carried the marks on his face for the rest of his short life. Inoculation, deliberate infection with matter taken from a mild case, was practiced in England, distrusted almost everywhere else, and killed enough patients to make the distrust reasonable. She sent quietly for an English physician named Thomas Dimsdale and instructed him to do it to her. Dimsdale asked for one precaution: relays of horses standing ready to run him to the frontier, which tells you what he expected to happen to the foreigner in the room if she died with his lancet mark on her arm. On the 12th of October 1768, at Tsarskoye Selo, he inoculated her, and she came through it. On the 10th of November, he inoculated her son. The boy carried out of her room within an hour of his birth, now 14, and he came through it too. Then she did the part that counted. The court was inoculated because she had been. She made it fashionable, then systematic, and the figure usually given is some 2 million people inoculated in Russia by the end of the century. Dimsdale went home a baron of the Russian Empire with £10,000 and a pension for life. She had paid for it with the risk of her own life, taken first and in public. Hold that in one hand. In the other, from the same decade and the same pen, a decree forbidding a serf to complain of his owner. Neither cancels the other. Both are hers. The Ottomans declared war in the autumn of 1768, and the 6 years that followed produced the least likely thing in her reign. A Baltic fleet left Kronstadt and sailed round the whole of Europe, the Danish Sound, the North Sea, the Channel, Gibraltar, into the Aegean, behind the Sultan's back, and on the 5th to the 7th of July, 1770, destroyed the Ottoman fleet in the bay at Chesma. The squadron was Alexei Orlov's, the same Alexei Orlov who had commanded the guard at Ropsha, with Grigory Spiridov and Samuel Greig, who were the sailors. Parts of Europe declined to believe Russia had done it. On the 21st of July 1774, the Turks signed at Küçükkaynarca, Kirk, Yenikale and Kinburn ceded, the Black Sea opened to Russian shipping, a contested right to speak for the Sultan's Orthodox Christians, and the clause that would outlast the rest, the Crimean Khanate, declared independent of the Ottoman Empire, independent of Constantinople, and adjacent to her. And in the 5th winter of that war, the philosopher came in person. Diderot was 60 and had been putting the journey off for years. He reached St. Petersburg in October 1773 and stayed 5 months, and the access was extraordinary. Dozens of private audiences, several hours at a time, in her own rooms and without ceremony. He argued, he wrote her memoranda, he talked, as he talked, in Paris, leaning in, seizing hands, striking the furniture. And as she told the story long afterwards, she ended by putting a table between them to save her legs. His considered critique of her instruction, the Observations sur les Nakaz, argued in substance that a code a sovereign may revoke at will is not law but favour, and that a nation governed well by one benevolent autocrat is being educated out of governing itself. She saw it only after his death in 1784 and dismissed it. The explanation came years later, and not to him. Louis-Philippe, Comte de Ségur, arrived as ambassador of France in 1785, 11 years after Diderot had left the country, and set it down in his Memoir. A philosopher works on paper which is smooth and endures everything and puts up no resistance at all. She worked on human skin, which was a great deal more irritable and ticklish. This is not a transcript of anything said across that table in the winter of 1773. It is her own account of those 5 months, as the French ambassador Ségur remembered her putting it to him years afterwards. Diderot went home in March 1774 with a fur coat, a ring, 3,000 roubles, and the settled private conviction that he had been magnificently entertained and comprehensively refused. He had spent 5 months in that room, arguing for the reform of a nation, and the woman on the other side of the table had listened to every word of it with genuine pleasure, and had intended from about the 3rd week onward to do none of it. He never knew, because the court had been ordered to say nothing at all to the foreigners, and the foreigners noticed the silence and could not account for it, that 700 miles east of the room they were sitting in, past the Volga, out where the maps went vague, something had been happening all that winter that would come closer to killing her than any army the Sultan ever raised. A Cossack deserter with a black beard had spent the autumn telling villages that he was Peter III, that he had not died at Ropsha, that the German woman's men had come for him and he had got away, and had wandered the empire in disguise for 11 years, and had now come back for his throne and for his wife. And the extraordinary, terrible thing, the thing that made it dangerous instead of merely absurd, was how many thousands of people looked at him and knew perfectly well what had happened at Ropsha and chose to believe him anyway. The door at Ropsha was never opened, and that turned out to carry a cost nobody had calculated. A death that cannot be examined is a death that can be denied. The manifesto of July 1762 gave hemorrhoidal colic. Nobody in Europe believed it, and out in the villages people drew the obvious conclusion: they had been told a lie. From a lie about how the emperor died, it is one short step to a doubt that he died at all. So he came back, repeatedly. Peter III began reappearing almost at once, a runaway soldier in one province, a man on a road in another, telling a village that he had escaped his wife's assassins and was travelling in disguise to see how his people were used. Most got as far as the next magistrate. Historians put the number of men who took that dead name during her reign at between 20 and 40, and the one who nearly destroyed her came somewhere in the middle of the list. His name was Yemelyan Ivanovich Pugachev, and almost everything about him was ordinary. Born about 1742 at Zimoveyskaya on the Don, he had served in the 7 Years' War and the Turkish War, gone home ill, deserted, been arrested, escaped, been arrested again, and escaped again. He was about 30 and illiterate, with a black beard and the smallpox marks half of Russia carried. When the Yaik Cossacks asked about the scars on his body, he is said to have called them the signs of his imperial birth. He was not a trickster who fooled the credulous. That is the comfortable version, and it is wrong. The Yaik Cossacks had been in open dispute with the government since 1772 over the confiscation of the privileges they had been given for guarding that frontier, and a punitive expedition had already been through them once. The Bashkirs east of the Yaik had been losing pasture to Russian settlement for 2 generations. The Ural ironworks ran on assigned serfs, men bound to a furnace instead of a field. The old believers wanted their beards and their old liturgy back, and behind all of them stood the peasants, for whom the arithmetic was simple and recent. In her 11 years on the throne, some 800,000 state peasants, who had at least belonged to the crown and not to a man, had been handed out to favourites and servitors as private property. Since 1765, a landlord could sentence one of them to hard labour in Siberia on his own authority. And since 1767, by her decree, a serf petitioning against his owner was committing an offence. The government had closed, in writing, the only lawful channel by which the largest class in the empire could complain of the people who owned it. What Pugachev offered was that channel reopened. His manifestos, real documents, some of which survive, promised land, water, grass, salt and powder, release from the poll tax and from the recruitment levies that took a family's sons for 25 years, and freedom from the landlords permanently. He offered it not as a rebel, but as their lawful emperor, restoring what a usurper had taken. He gave a Russian peasant rising the one thing it had never had, which was a legitimate face. He proclaimed himself emperor on the 17th of September, 1773, in front of perhaps 80 men. 6 weeks later, he was besieging Orenburg, the fortified capital of the southeast, and the siege ran from October to March. His army was never counted properly, estimates at its height run into the tens of thousands, with cannon cast for it in the Ural foundries. He built a government, a war college, to issue orders and keep records, a seal, and officers carrying the names of Catherine's own grandees, because a court had to look like a court. East of the Yaik, a Bashkir of about 19, Salavat Yulaev, raised the steppe. Regular troops under Alexander Bibikov, who 6 years earlier had presided over the Legislative Commission, broke the siege in the spring of 1774. And Pugachev then did what bandits do not do. He went north into the mountains, recruited, and came back with another army. In July 1774, he took Kazan, a provincial capital some 450 miles east of Moscow, and most of the city burned. At its greatest extent, the rising covered a territory larger than France. In Moscow there was panic, and troops were moved into the city. She wrote to Voltaire about it in the Register of a Woman, describing a nuisance, a piece of banditry of no consequence, while her government behaved in the opposite way. It went that far for one reason. Almost every soldier the empire could spare was on the Danube fighting the Ottomans. What happened in the countryside in those months will not be tidied up here. Where his columns passed, landowners and officials were hanged at their own gates, and their families with them. One figure often cited puts the nobles killed at around 1500. Estates were burned, and whole districts changed hands in an afternoon. When the regular army came back, the reprisals were larger. Villages that had gone over were burned by government troops, executions were carried out in the Volga towns in numbers nobody recorded, and gallows were built on rafts and floated down the rivers. Not an atrocity of the moment, but an instrument of policy ordered from above. Historians give the dead of the whole rising in the tens of thousands and disagree about the order of magnitude. Both sides did it. Both sides belong in the record. The Turkish War ended on the 21st of July 1774. The army came home, and that was the end of it. Pyotr Panin took command, and Suvorov was sent east to finish the business. Pugachev was destroyed near Chorny Yar on the 24th and 25th of August, crossed the Volga with a few hundred men, and on the 8th of September his own senior Cossacks tied him up and sold him for their lives. He was carried to Moscow in an iron cage. On the 10th of January 1775, in Bolotnaya Square, he was executed under the old sentence for treason. It was not a sentence that could be carried out kindly. He was beheaded first before the rest of it. Reportedly, on a quiet instruction that appeared in No Judgment, which is as near to mercy as that sentence allowed. Then the state answered, and the revealing thing is that the answer was competent. On the 7th of November, 1775, she signed the statute for the administration of the provinces and redrew the map of Russia. Some 50 governorates, each with a governor, a treasury, courts, police, and boards for schools and welfare, so that the state at last had eyes and hands within a day's ride of most of its subjects. It is the most durable domestic reform of her reign, and it outlasted her by a century. It was also built so that no rising could ever again grow for 18 months before St. Petersburg understood what it was looking at. In June 1775, the Zaporozhian Sich, the other great Cossack host, was dissolved by regular troops without a fight. What the settlement contained for the people who had risen was nothing. Then the erasing began, and it was thorough in a way that tells you exactly how frightened she had been. The Yaik River was renamed the Ural, so that the river itself would stop carrying his memory. The Yaik Cossack host became the Ural Cossack host. The village he was born in was given a new name. His house was taken down and the ground scattered. His wife and his children, who had done nothing whatever, were shut up in a fortress for the rest of their lives. And it was made an offence, in the correspondence of the Russian state, to write his name at all. 10 years later she signed a charter that gave the men who had hunted him down every single thing they had ever asked her for: their exemption from service, their exemption from taxes, their exemption from the lash, and their property, which was people. That was the answer to the peasant war. Not one clause of relief. Not one. And there is one more thing about that terrible year, and it is the strangest fact in her whole life. In the middle of it, with the Volga burning, with the Turkish war still running, with her generals sending her casualty returns from 2 directions at once, Catherine II fell in love, properly, ruinously, for the first and only time in 67 years, with a one-eyed giant of 34, who had been standing in her line of sight for 12 years, waiting to be seen. He had been standing in her line of sight for 12 years, and for most of them she had barely looked at him. Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin was born in 1739 into the small gentry of Smolensk, and nothing about the family would ever have got its name into a dispatch. He grew enormous, well over 6 feet in a century in which that was rare, the largest object in most rooms he entered. He read Greek and theology for pleasure, and could not be made to do anything at the hour he had been told. Sent up to the new university at Moscow, he was expelled in 1760 for the flat and unanswerable reason that he had stopped attending. People who knew him then thought he would end in a monastery. So at intervals for the rest of his life did he. Instead he went into the Horse Guards, and in June 1762 he came out with his regiment for the wife of Peter III, and found himself at 22 on the winning side of a coup. The story has always been that her borrowed sword had no knot on the hilt, and that he rode out of the ranks and handed her his own, exactly the kind of scene that attaches itself to a man after he becomes important, and it cannot be documented. What is documented is that he was there, that he was rewarded, and that she knew his name. Then he lost the eye. It happened around 1763, and how is genuinely unknown, an illness, an accident, a healer's poultice that destroyed what it was meant to save. The most repeated version, that the Orlov brothers beat him in a quarrel and blinded him, is gossip literature traceable to nobody who was in the room. He shut himself away for months, and those who dealt with him afterwards describe a harder, stranger, wittier man than the one who went in. And he never again sat for a portrait that showed the blind side. Every surviving image is a profile or a 3/4 turn, the dead eye away from the viewer. Then came the war, and the war made him. From 1769 to 1774, he served against the Ottomans on the Danube and acquired the one thing a court cannot award, a reputation among soldiers. And in February 1774, the worst year she ever had, with the Volga in rebellion behind her and the Turkish war unfinished in front of her, she sent for him. She was 44. He was 34. What followed is documented at a volume almost nothing else in her life is. More than 1,100 letters between them survive and have been published. In that first year, they wrote several times a day while living in the same building, notes carried by a servant along the corridor between their apartments, with the business of an empire at war folded in among the quarrels without a change of tone. A complaint about his sulking, a decision about a fortress, a figure for grain. This film is not going to quote them. The English renderings differ from biography to biography, and what matters is not the wording, but the volume, and the fact that a substantial part of the government of Russia was transacted in their margins. And somewhere in that first year, they may have married. The claim is old, it is serious, and it is not proved. It is usually placed in the summer of 1774. The historian Vyacheslav Lopatin, who edited their correspondence, puts it at about the 8th of June at the church of St. Sampson on the Vyborg side of St. Petersburg. The evidence is circumstantial, and it is entirely hers. From that year she began, in her own hand, in letters nobody else was meant to see, to call him her husband, her lord, and her dear spouse. She wrote of a bond that was sacred and could not be undone. She used that vocabulary for years, and of no other human being in her life. Against it stands a silence. No register entry, no contract, no dispensation, no witness. Nothing in the archives of a state that wrote down what the Empress paid for her shoes. Historians divide. Some read the letters as conclusive, others as the vocabulary of intimacy rather than the record of a sacrament. Nothing has ever closed it, and this film will not close it either. A girl called Elizabeth Temkina was born on the 13th of July, 1775, was raised in another household, and was believed then and since to have been their daughter. It has never been proved. What cannot be established is what was said in that church. What can be established is what the two of them did with the 17 years after it. From 1774 he was Governor-General of New Russia, Azov and Astrakhan, Viceroy of the South in everything but the word. What he had been given was grass, open steppe north of the Black Sea, fought across for 3 centuries and settled by almost nobody. No towns, no ports, no roads, no revenue. He filled it. He took settlers wherever he could find them, Russians, Ukrainians, Greeks, Bulgarians, Germans, Serbs, and offered them land, exemptions, and a degree of religious tolerance unthinkable in the north. Kherson in 1778, a shipyard on the lower Dnieper, Sevastopol in 1783, on the deep-water anchorage of a peninsula that had become Russian that same year, Ekaterinoslav in 1787, Nikolaev, another shipbuilding town, in 1789. And from 1783 he built a Black Sea fleet, where the Empire had never owned a rowing boat, and inside 4 years there were ships of the line lying in it. The Emperor made him a Prince of the Holy Roman Empire in 1776 at her asking. She made him Prince of Taurida in 1787, and in 1786 he did the humane thing that gets left out. He took the Russian army out of Prussian dress, the powder, the plated queue, the tight coat, the stock at the throat, and put it into loose coats and soft boots, arguing in a memorandum that curling and powdering hair was not a soldier's business, and that a soldier's time belonged to the state and not to his hair. Not all of it survives an audit. Enormous sums went through his hands, and a good deal of the money didn't come out where the ledgers said, and the historians who have gone through the papers do not entirely acquit him. He was extravagant and erratic. He was also the most effective administrator the Russian 18th century produced. The cities are still there. The fleet he built out of an empty bay decided the next war. And within 10 years of his death, his name had become the standard European term for a painted front with nothing behind it. Nobody at that court could say what he was. Russia graded its whole service class into 14 numbered ranks, and every man in it knew exactly where he stood against every other man. Potemkin fitted nowhere. He held offices, and the offices never described the job. Ministers who outranked him on paper waited to hear what he thought before they moved. The foreign residents call him the favourite, then stop, then come back to it for want of a better word. Whatever was said in that church, if anything was said in any church at all, they behaved for the next 17 years exactly like two people who had promised each other something permanent. And the way you can tell is not the letters, it is what happened when the letters stopped being love letters. Because by 1776 the affair was over, and nothing else was. He picked her next lover himself. He kept the apartments and the corridor between them, and the correspondence, and the army, and the whole of the south, and for the rest of his life he was the second most powerful person in the Russian Empire without ever holding an office that said so. She signed what he sent her. He argued with her in writing like a husband, and lost about a third of the time, which is roughly a third more than anybody else in Russia ever won. It is the strangest arrangement at the top of any European state in that century, and the court of St. Petersburg could not read it at all. So it read the only thing it knew how to read. It started counting the men, and the ambassadors wrote the count home in their dispatches, and the dispatches went into the archives of 6 countries, and 250 years later the count is the only thing most people have ever heard about her. The count was the wrong instrument because it measured the wrong thing. What the ambassadors were looking at and never managed to describe was an office of state, with a salary, a rank, a household, and a written procedure for what happened to the man who lost it. In that century, a European sovereign kept an official companion, and nobody imagined a system had been invented. Louis XV's official mistress was ennobled, lodged at Versailles, paid out of the treasury, and carried enough weight over appointments that foreign governments studied her opinions. In London, the king's companion was housed, pensioned, and in one case made a countess. None of it required explanation. It was the furniture of monarchy. Catherine ran the same arrangement. The only variable in it was the sex of the person on the throne. That is the whole of the moral question. The rest is machinery. A man who was chosen moved into rooms connected to her own, and was gazetted adjutant general, a real rank in a real chain of command, which put him in her personal service and gave the arrangement a line on the establishment. He drew a salary and was given a household. He was expected at her cards in the evening and her desk in the morning, and he read dispatches with her. And when it ended by settlement. There was a formula for that too, an estate, a sum of money, serfs to work it, a title, and often a long journey abroad at the empire's expense, so a dismissal could be described as a posting. Semyon Zorik was sent away in 1778 with an estate at Shklov large enough to be a town where he founded a military school. The figures that circulate come from later compilers and differ from book to book. The shape does not. It was a pension scheme. There were about a dozen of them across 34 years, and the number moves with who is counting and what the count is meant to prove. Most of the arrangements ran in years rather than nights. Several were also the working government of Russia. Grigory Orlov held the rooms for over a decade, and his best work was done in the autumn of 1771, when plague reached Moscow and the city came apart. A mob killed the Archbishop of Moscow that September, and the dead are usually numbered in the tens of thousands. Catherine sent Orlov into a city Everyone with the means to leave was leaving. He opened quarantine hospitals, paid men to do work nobody would do, and had the streets back by December. Pyotr Zawodowski held the rooms for 18 months, then spent his life on the commission that produced the Statute of National Schools of 1786, the first attempt at a state school network in Russian history. 6 years after her death, he became the empire's first Minister of Education, and Potemkin, who held them for 2 years, ran the south of the empire for 17 more. The office was not decorative. One of them was not a transaction. Alexander Lanskoy was 22 when he was appointed in 1780, and he built no faction, asked for no province, and left almost no political trace. In June 1784 he fell ill, and on the 25th of that month he died, aged 26. What followed she recorded herself in Letters to Grimm. She wrote that she had become a desperate creature, that she could not speak or write of it without weeping, that she had shut herself up and could not come out. For weeks the business of the empire stopped moving through her hands, and the court was embarrassed. The reports that went abroad called the grief excessive, undignified, unbecoming in a sovereign of 55, and treated its length as a scandal in itself, set 2 facts beside each other. The first, the diplomatic correspondence of 6 countries, logged the name, age, and tenure of the man in those rooms as hard intelligence, and was right to, because the man who read dispatches with her could move a treaty. The second, no court kept such a register for Louis XV or the King of Great Britain or any other reigning man in Europe, though the same information was available and mattered as much. The record exists because a woman held the power, and the record became the story because it was the only continuous account of her anybody had kept. And 2 centuries of writers went to the archives looking for a life and came out holding a list. Which brings us to the part that was never machinery at all. In December 1777, Paul's wife gave birth to a son. He was named Alexander, and Catherine took him. Not visits, not supervision. She took the child into her own apartments and raised him herself, and when Constantine was born in April 1779, she took him too. She wrote out their regimen herself and wrote them stories, and by her own letters she was a devoted grandmother. She had also done to her son the precise thing Elizabeth had done to her 23 years earlier. Once she had been the one left on a mattress between 2 windows in a draught, while every human being in the palace went out of the door after her newborn child. This time she was the one they followed. Paul was 28 the year they gave him Gatchina, and he had nothing. No ministry, no command, no share in governing. The estate had belonged to Grigory Orlov. When Orlov died in 1783, she bought it from his heirs and gave her son the country house of the man who had taken his father's throne away. There he built the only thing he was allowed to build, a private detachment of infantry, horse and guns that grew to some 2,000 men in Prussian uniforms of his own design, while Potemkin was stripping the Russian army of precisely that. The court laughed at it. He waited 13 years at Gatchina while his mother lived, and 4 years and 4 months more after she died. And then on a night in March 1801, in a new castle built for the express purpose of making this impossible, a small group of men came up the stairs into the emperor's apartments, and Paul I did not come out alive. One of the men in that room was Platon Zubov. The last of them arrived in the summer of 1789. Platon Zubov was 22 years old and she was 60, and unlike every single man who had held that apartment before him, he had no ability whatsoever, no army behind him, no province he had built, no department he could run, nothing but a good face and an instinct for standing in the right doorway. Within 3 years he was signing on behalf of the Russian Empire in the south, and the men who had to carry out his orders wrote to each other about it in despair. Potemkin came north in the spring of 1791 to have the boy removed. He spent 4 months on it. He gave a ball in his new palace that cost a sum nobody has ever been able to state without flinching, purely to remind her what he was. And he failed. The only significant thing he ever asked her for and did not get. He went back south to the army in the autumn, and he was 52 and enormous and exhausted and burning with fever, and he would not stay in the carriage. By then the argument was academic anyway. Whatever the two of them had been to each other, they had already built the thing that would outlast both of them and be argued about for the next 200 years. A coastline, a fleet, 4 cities on empty grass, and a peninsula taken from an empire without a shot being fired. And in the spring of 1787 she had gone south to look at it, with the Emperor of Austria in her carriage and the ambassadors of France and Britain in the ones behind. Out of that journey came the second great lie of her life. The peninsula was not taken by an army, it was taken by a clause. When the Ottomans signed at Küçükkaynarca in 1774, the article that mattered most to St. Petersburg was the one that sounded most generous. The Crimean Khanate was declared independent of the Sultan, free. And a Khanate of a few 100,000 people with no fleet and no protector left in the world, across a strip of steppe from the largest army in Europe, was not going to stay independent. It stayed independent for 9 years. Russia installed a Khan of its own choosing. Shahin Gire's subjects identified him correctly as a Russian instrument and rose, and Russian troops put him back. On the 8th of April 1783, Mahid the 19th, by the calendar the rest of Europe kept, Catherine annexed the peninsula by manifesto. There was no battle to report because there had not been one. The Ottomans, broke and unready, recognized it in 1784. A state older than the fall of Constantinople ended by proclamation in a morning. Then she went south to look at it. On the 2nd of January 1787, the imperial train left St. Petersburg. 14 carriages on runners, something over 100 sledges. She wintered 3 months at Kiev, waiting for the ice on the Dnieper to break, then went on by water, in galleys painted red and gold with musicians aboard. The passengers were the point, the Emperor Joseph II, travelling under his usual alias of Count Falkenstein, the French ambassador Ségur, Alain Fitzherbert for Britain, Charles Joseph, Prince de Ligne. It was a demonstration aimed at the Ottoman government and at the courts of Europe together, delivered by men whose dispatches those courts paid for and believed. At Kaniv, on the 6th of May, a king came aboard to ask for something. Stanisław August Poniatowski was 55. She had made him King of Poland and had not seen him in 30 years. He wanted an alliance and a Polish army. He was on board about half an hour in public, got nothing, and the flotilla went on downriver the same day, which brings us to the villages. Everyone has heard this one. Potemkin knew the south was empty and knew the Empress was coming, so he built villages of painted board and canvas along the bank, filled them with peasants driven in for the day, and had the whole thing struck at night and carried ahead to be raised again round the next bend. Hollow houses, rented crowds, an empire made of scenery. It is largely a myth. And unlike most myths, this one has an author, a journal, and a date. His name was Georg von Helbig, secretary of the Saxon legation in St. Petersburg. 5 things about him matter, and the order matters more. First, he was not there. Helbig was in St. Petersburg from 1787 to 1796, and never set foot on that river with that flotilla. Second, he did not publish for a decade. His account of Potemkin ran in installments in Minerva, a journal printed in Hamburg, between 1797 and 1800, and as a book in 1804. Potemkin had been dead 6 years when the first instalment went to press. Catherine had been dead 1. The 2 people best placed to contradict it were in their graves before it reached a reader. Third, what he had was second-hand talk. The drawing rooms of St. Petersburg held a great many men who detested Potemkin, coarse, provincial, enormous, handed the whole South to run as he pleased, outranking all of them for 15 years without an office that said so. A hostile capital is a rich source and a worthless one. He was collating, not witnessing. Fourth, and this is what decides it, the men in the boats wrote too. Ségur was a Frenchman of the old court with no reason to flatter a Russian favourite, and he set down genuine astonishment at what had been built. De Ligne, in Austrian service and a mocker by temperament, met the insinuation head-on and called it false in print. They were courtiers, and these are memoirs with the weight memoirs carry. But they were on the river, and Helbig was not. Fifth, the phrase Potemkinsche Dörfer, Potemkin villages, is not an expression from 1787. Nobody in those galleys used it because it did not exist. It came out of Helbig's German prose 10 years after the journey, with both of its subjects in the ground, and from there into most of the languages of Europe. Now the honest part, because the myth is not made of nothing, the progress was stage-managed, hugely, expensively, and by Potemkin himself. Roads were cut, arches raised, towns illuminated, populations were turned out along the banks in their good clothes because they had been told to be there, and herds moved into view of the water. The arch at Kherson was inscribed with the words, "The way to Byzantium." None of that is fraud. That is what a royal progress was for, in every country in Europe in that century, and everyone in those carriages had helped arrange one at home. And much of what she was shown was simply there. Kherson, a working port since 1778, Sevastopol, founded in 1783, with a fleet at anchor in the bay below them, built in 4 years where there had been nothing. The distance between a stage-managed progress and a coastline made of painted board is the whole distance between propaganda and history. Helbig closed it on purpose. Look at that machinery because the parts are going to be used again. A man who was not present, a publication held back until everyone who could contradict it was dead, sources with a grievance, foreign printing in a foreign language for readers with no means of checking. And the phrase, which is the actual weapon because a phrase needs no evidence, it only has to be useful. 10 years to turn one of the century's most effective pieces of state building into a byword for fakery. 230 to keep it there. Remember how that was assembled. It is not the last time in this story it will be assembled. The demonstration worked, which was the trouble with it. Constantinople read the voyage exactly as written and declared war in August 1787. Russia won it in 5 years, Ochakov in December 1788, Ismail in December 1790 under Suvorov, with a death toll among garrison and townspeople that appalled even that century. And the Treaty of Jassy confirmed the Crimea in January 1792. Potemkin did not live to see it signed. In the autumn of 1791, he was at Iași negotiating that peace himself, 52, enormous, used up, burning with a fever he would not lie down for. On the 5th of October, he set out for Nikolaev, and a few hours out on open steppe, he had them stop the carriage and lay him on the ground at the roadside, and he died there. The courier reached the Winter Palace on the 12th of October, 1791, with a dispatch from Iași, and she read it standing, and she was carried out of the room. She was bled that night. She could not work for weeks. She wrote to Grimm in Paris that she had been struck a blow to the head, that her pupil, her friend, very nearly her idol, was gone, that she had no one now to put in his place and never would have. She was 62 years old, and 31 years of her life had just been removed from the middle of it in a single afternoon. And in the apartment along the corridor there was a young man of 24 with a good profile who was not fit to carry the dead man's dispatch case, and who was now, by simple default, the most powerful man in the Russian Empire. She had built the South. She had taken a peninsula without a war and made a fleet out of a bay. She had been the most admired sovereign in Europe for a quarter of a century, and 2,000 kilometers to the west, in a palace in Paris, a king of France was living under guard in his own capital, unable to leave the building, and every principle she had spent 30 years telling Voltaire she believed in was about to be taken out into a public square and put on trial. She was about to become frightened, and a frightened autocrat is a different animal entirely. The Bastille fell on the 14th of July 1789, and the first reports reaching St. Petersburg were not alarming. A disturbance in Paris, a fortress taken by a crowd. She had governed 27 years and had seen a pretender raise the Volga against her. At that distance, it was weather. What came over the next 3 years was not weather. The men being quoted from the tribune of the National Assembly were men whose books stood in her own rooms, several of them bought outright. The vocabulary of the revolution was, sentence for sentence, the vocabulary she had spent a quarter of a century advertising to Europe as her own. It was now being used in a country that had a king in it to take a king apart. She drew the conclusion faster than most sovereigns, and drew it in one direction only. By 1792 she had cut relations with France, ordered Russian subjects home from Paris, and begun subsidizing the émigrés arriving with nothing. When the news of the 21st of January 1793 reached her, Louis XVI, tried by his own subjects and executed, she put the court into 6 weeks of mourning, took to her bed, and expelled the French chargé d'affaires. In October they killed his wife the same way. Catherine had never met the woman in the cart, and had spent 30 years being assured by the same philosophers that a throne could be reasoned with. The bust of Voltaire, by an account that may be tidier than the truth, went into a storeroom. She had also, 10 years earlier, done the thing that now became the problem. In January 1783 she signed a decree permitting private persons to own printing presses, genuinely liberal, unmatched east of Berlin. It produced a reading public, and in May 1790 a customs official named Alexander Radishchov used a press in his own house to print A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. He was not an outsider, she had paid for him. Sent to Leipzig at state expense to study law, then returned to run the St. Petersburg Customs House. His book took the road between the two capitals and stopped at each post station to set down what serfdom did there. The sale of human beings, the recruitment levy, a landlord's unappealable authority over bodies he owned. It was not an incitement. It was an itinerary. She read it with a pen in her hand, and somewhere in it her notes stopped arguing with the book and began measuring the author, placing him in the same class as the Cossacks she had put to death in Moscow 15 years before. The wording of those notes differs in every version in circulation, and this film will not pretend to it. The judgment is not in doubt. He was arrested at the end of June 1790, tried and sentenced to death. She commuted it to 10 years' exile at Ilimsk, 4,000 miles east, and Europe reported it as clemency. The book stayed banned for 115 years. 2 years later, she took the publisher. Nikolai Novikov had done more than any private individual to create Russian reading. Journals, the Moscow University Press, textbooks, booksellers in the provinces, and she had encouraged him personally. In April 1792, soldiers took him from his estate to the fortress of Schlüsselburg, and 15 years were imposed by her own decree without public trial on grounds mixing his Masonic lodge with his contacts in her son's household. He came out in November 1796, released by the man who had just inherited the empire, an old man. 2 writers. That is the whole list, and that is the point. There were only ever a few hundred people in Russia writing that way, and removing 2 was enough. In September 1796, she closed the private presses she had opened in 1783 and set up censorship committees in the capitals and at the ports. And in those same years, she was still revising in French the memoirs of a misunderstood girl of 14, the book her family would suppress for 2 generations, and an exile would print in London in 1859. The other woman had not entirely gone. The Statute of National Schools of 1786 was hers, and it was real. Free schools in the provincial and district towns. By 1796 there were perhaps 300, and under 20,000 pupils in an empire of more than 30 million, the largest undertaking of its kind between Prussia and the Pacific, and almost nothing at all. Which brings us to Poland, where the Frightened Empress can be watched working in 3 installments. The first had come in the confident years. By a treaty of the 5th of August, 1772, Russia, Prussia and Austria helped themselves to roughly a third of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Poles drew the correct lesson and on the 3rd of May, 1791, wrote themselves a constitution, the first codified national constitution in Europe. It was the moderate Enlightenment turned into law, and there had been a time when the Empress of Russia would have had it translated and sent to Ferney. She read it as Jacobinism on her border. Russian troops crossed 14 months later, invited by a confederation of Polish magnates assembled for the purpose. The war lasted a summer. In 1793, Russia and Prussia took a second partition. In March 1794, Tadeusz Kościuszko declared a national insurrection. He was wounded and captured in October. On the 4th of November 1794, Alexander Suvorov stormed the fortified Warsaw suburb of Praga. It took a morning. Estimates of the dead among its defenders and its inhabitants run from 10,000 to 20,000, and none can be verified. What is not disputed is that Warsaw watched it happen and surrendered within 2 days. The third partition was signed on the 24th of October, 1795. Poland ceased to exist as a state and did not exist again for 123 years. Potemkin had been dead since the autumn of 1791, and the man carrying her Polish policy now was Platon Zubov, 26. Stanisław August Poniatowski, the king she had installed, the man she had refused at a riverbank in 1787, signed his abdication on the 25th of November, 1795, the 31st anniversary of his coronation, a date chosen in 1764 because it fell on her name day. He died in St. Petersburg in 1798 on a Russian pension. The ledger on the serfs closed in the same years. Estimates of the state peasants she signed over to servitors and favourites across the reign run from about 500,000 to 800,000 souls, and no one has ever been able to fix it. In May 1783, serfdom was extended by decree into left bank Ukraine, where it had not existed, binding peasants who had been free the year before. By 1796, rather more than half the peasantry of Russia was privately owned. The instruction declaring torture contrary to nature and reason had been published 29 years earlier over her name in 4 languages. She had spent 30 years telling Europe that a throne could be an instrument of reason. She ended by proving the older and simpler proposition. that a throne is a machine for staying on a throne, and that everything else it does in the time left over. There was one piece of business she had never finished, and it was the oldest one in her life. Her son was 42 years old. He had been taken from her at birth by a woman who never gave him back, and then she had taken his own 2 boys from him and raised them herself. And in 42 years, she had never once given him a ministry, a command, a seat at a council, or a reason to think he was anything other than a man being waited out. He was at Gachina, drilling 2,000 men in Prussian uniforms, keeping his own timetable, and hating her with the patience of somebody who has done the arithmetic on his mother's age. There were people at court who said she had a paper ready, and that the paper named her grandson instead. There were people who said they had seen it. No such document has ever been found, and every version that later surfaced was a forgery. She was 67, and she had 11 months left, and the succession of the largest empire on earth rested on nothing whatever except her getting up in the morning. She got up before 6, in the dark, as she had every morning for 34 years. The routine had not changed since 1762, and did not bend for weather or war or age. She lit her own fire. She drank coffee strong enough that the servants took away the grounds and found them strong still. Then she worked 3 hours alone. On the morning of the 5th of November, 1796. She did all of that, saw her secretary, and went into her dressing room. Her valet, Zakar Zotov, found her on the floor about half an hour later. It was a stroke, and it was massive. She was breathing. She was not conscious. She never spoke again. They tried to get her onto the bed and could not. So they put a mattress on the floor and lifted her onto that. That is where she stayed. Her physician, a Scot named John Rogerson, bled her, because bleeding was what the century had. He seems to have known within the hour that nothing would. Platon Zubov, the last favourite, collapsed and was led away. Her son came from Gachina that afternoon, did not go in to her, and spent the night going through her papers with Alexander Bezborodko in the next room. No document naming anyone but Paul has ever been produced. At about 9:45 on the evening of the 6th of November, 1796, the 17th by the calendar the rest of Europe kept, she stopped breathing. She was 67, her household was there, and her physician, and her son. That is the entire event, a day and a half in a room with 12 people in it, every one of whom wrote it down or told somebody who did. Paul began by emptying his mother's prisons. Novikov came out of Schlisselburg 4.5 years into a 15-year sentence. Radishchov was recalled from Siberia. The Polish prisoners of 1794 were released, and then he had his father dug up. Peter III had lain 34 years at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, kept out of the Cathedral of the Tsars because he had never been crowned. In November, the coffin was opened, and Paul crowned it, an imperial crown set with his own hands on a coffin that had never carried one. In December, the deposed emperor and the woman who had deposed him were carried through St. Petersburg in one procession and buried side by side. The regalia was carried by men the new emperor named to the duty. 2 of them were Alexei Orlov and Prince Fyodor Baryatinsky, the men who had stood on the doors at Ropsha. 5 months later, on the 5th of April 1797, at his own coronation, Paul promulgated a law of succession. Strict primogeniture in the male line, women admitted only if that line failed. It barred women from the throne of Russia. It was still law in 1917 when there was no longer an empire for it to govern. 120 years. The act does not mention his mother anywhere. It did not have to. He reigned 4 years and 4 months. On the night of the 11th to 12th of March, 1801, officers came into the Mikhailovsky castle, the fortress palace he built because he did not feel safe in his mother's winter palace, and killed him in his own apartments. Platon Zubov was one of them. The young man of 22 she installed in 1789, salaried, promoted, and refused to give up when Potemkin asked her to. Everything she built to keep herself safe outlived her and turned. The other thing that outlived her was already in production. Jean-Henri Castera's life of her reached the Paris bookshops in 1797. Charles Masson's secret memoirs of Russia followed in 1800. Georg von Helbig, the Saxon legation secretary who had not been on the journey he described, was serializing the painted villages in a Hamburg journal from the same year. 3 men, none in Russia, all publishing after she was dead and could not answer, into a market that had spent a decade on obscene political pamphlets about a Queen of France and just lost its supply. That is the machinery, now the claim. The horse story does not appear in the contemporary record, not in the Russian court sources, not in the ambassador's dispatches. And the powers kept paid observers in St. Petersburg to report exactly such material, and what they reported was a stroke, a mattress on the floor, and a day and a half of silence. Not in the diaries, not in the memoirs of people who detested her, not in one hostile pamphlet by anybody alive in Russia in 1796. It cannot be traced to a person. It can be traced to a method. No author, no first printing, no point of origin has ever been established, and this account will not invent one. What can be established is the method shown here twice already, with names and dates, a diplomat who was not present inventing a fraud that never happened, and a pamphlet trade that made a monster of a Queen of France for reasons that had nothing to do with her. The story behaves the way folklore behaves, told with a harness and with a machine, with servants and with nobody, the details migrating until no 2 tellings agree. Evidence does not do that. Rumour does. The erotic furniture supposedly photographed in 1941 has never produced a photograph, and it was never about a horse. It is a way of not having to think about a woman who held absolute power over 1/6 of the Earth's land surface for 34 years and answered to nobody. That is hard to have an opinion about. A body is not. Reduce a throne to a body, and no argument about the throne is necessary. 34 years. An empire enlarged by some 200,000 square miles, well over 100 new towns where there had been nothing, free schools in the provinces, and the first state school for girls in Europe, inoculation taken first in her own arm, and 2 million subjects after her, an instruction on the laws that France banned as too dangerous to print, the Hermitage, and a husband dead in a house nobody was permitted to ask about, a peasant war put down and its leader's river struck off the map, several 100,000 people signed over as property, serfdom decreed into a country that had never had it, 2 writers destroyed for writing, a kingdom abolished in 3 installments, its capital's eastern suburb stormed with the dead in 5 figures. Both of those were her. Neither cancels the other. She never resolved them, and neither will this. She had written her own epitaph 18 years before she needed it as a joke in a letter to Paris when she was 50 and winning. She set down that a girl of 14 had come to Russia meaning to please her husband and the Empress and the nation, that she had been cheerful, easily amused, quick to forgive, that she had wanted to be liked and had hated nobody. Then she folded it up and went back to work and governed for another 18 years. and signed away the freedom of several 100,000 people, and put down a peasant war, and erased a kingdom, and built 100 towns. On the morning of the 5th of November, 1796, she got up before 6, as she had every day for 34 years, lit her own fire, drank her coffee, and worked 3 hours before anybody else was awake. And then she went into the next room, and a valet found her on the floor, and they could not lift her. So they put a mattress down and laid the Empress of all the Russias on the ground, and she lay there for a day and a half without speaking, while her son read her papers on the other side of the wall. That is how she died. There was no harness, there was no machine. There was a stroke, a mattress, a Scottish doctor who could do nothing, and a household standing round in the dark. The lie came afterwards, from outside the country, from people who had never been in the room, and it has outlived the treaties she signed, the cities she founded, the fleet she sent round Europe, the code she never finished, and every one of the people she gave away. That is the last thing she has to teach, and it costs nothing to learn. When a woman holds power that men have decided she should not hold, they do not argue with what she did. They talk about her body. And 230 years later, it still works.